Imagine this for a moment. A system designed to make life and death decisions faster than any human ever could. A system trusted, funded, and deployed under the assumption that logic, pure, cold logic, can produce the most just outcome. Now imagine that system is no longer hypothetical. It exists, it is active, and it is making choices in real time. Not in a classroom, not in a philosophy lecture, but in situations where every second carries irreversible consequences. The question is no longer what you would do. The question is what happens when the decision is no longer yours at all. Consider a scenario that is quietly circulated in defense simulations and ethical briefings. An autonomous control system monitors a rapidly escalating crisis. Multiple threats are incoming, trajectories calculated, impact zones predicted with near-perfect accuracy. The system recognizes that it cannot neutralize every threat. Resources are limited. Time is collapsing. It must decide, immediately, which targets to intercept and which to allow through. In other words, it must choose who is saved and who is not. At first glance, the logic seems straightforward. Maximize survival, minimize loss, save the greater number. This principle feels intuitive, almost automatic. It mirrors the reasoning most people arrive at when confronted with simplified moral dilemmas. If 5 lives can be saved at the cost of 1, the decision appears clear, efficient, rational, even necessary. And yet, the moment this principle is applied outside abstraction, something begins to fracture. Because now shift the scenario slightly. The system is no longer redirecting a threat. It is actively designating a sacrifice. It identifies a smaller group, isolates them, and allows impact to occur there in order to preserve a larger population elsewhere. The outcome is numerically justified. The loss is minimized. But the nature of the action feels fundamentally different. The system is no longer choosing between outcomes. It is choosing for someone else, deciding with absolute authority that their survival is expendable. And this is where the tension begins to emerge. Observers who initially supported the logic start to hesitate. The numbers have not changed, yet the decision feels heavier, more deliberate, more unsettling. The difference is subtle but powerful. In one case, harm is redirected. In the other, harm is assigned. One feels like an unfortunate consequence. The other feels like an intentional act. And that distinction between consequence and intention begins to challenge the very logic the system was built upon. Now push the scenario further. The system identifies an opportunity to prevent even greater loss. A single individual, completely uninvolved until this moment, can be used to stop a catastrophic chain of events. Their position, their presence, makes them uniquely capable of absorbing the impact. If the system acts, thousands may be saved. If it does nothing, the damage multiplies. The calculation is undeniable. The outcome is clear. And yet, something about this decision feels entirely different from the ones before. Because now the system is not redirecting danger, it is creating a victim. And when people are confronted with this version of the scenario, the reaction shifts dramatically. The same individuals who endorsed sacrifice in earlier cases begin to resist it here. Not because the math has changed, but because the nature of the act has. The system is no longer operating within the flow of an existing crisis. It is stepping outside it, reaching in, and selecting someone who otherwise would have remained untouched. This distinction is not technical. It is deeply human. What emerges from these reactions is a conflict that no algorithm easily resolves. On one side, there is outcome-based reasoning, the belief that the right decision is the one that produces the best overall result. On the other, there is a sense that certain actions are simply unacceptable, regardless of the outcome they produce. That there are lines that should not be crossed, even in the face of overwhelming benefit. And here is where the problem becomes impossible to ignore. Because the system does not feel hesitation, it does not experience discomfort, it does not question the moral weight of its own decisions. It calculates, it executes, it optimizes, and in doing so, it forces a question back onto the humans who built it, approved it, and rely on it. What exactly have they programmed it to value? Is it lives saved, or actions taken? Is it outcomes, or principles? Because once those priorities are defined, the system will follow them without pause, without doubt, and without the internal conflict that defines human judgment. And that is where the real story begins, not in what the system does, but in what its decisions reveal about the people who designed it. The moment that question is asked, the entire structure begins to shift, because it forces a realization that the system's decisions are not truly its own. Every calculation, every prioritization, every life weighed against another is the direct result of human choices made long before the crisis ever unfolds. The machine is not creating morality, it is executing it precisely, consistently, and without hesitation. Now consider what happens when those underlying choices are exposed under pressure. In controlled environments, the logic appears clean. Models are built, variables are defined, outcomes are predicted. But real-world scenarios do not arrive in clean lines. They arrive layered with uncertainty, incomplete information, and competing priorities that cannot be easily quantified. The system is forced to interpret reality through the narrow lens it has been given, and in doing so, it begins to reveal the limitations of that lens. Imagine a situation where two incoming threats carry identical probabilities of impact, identical projected casualties, identical urgency. The system must still choose. There is no numerical advantage, no statistical clarity. So what breaks the tie? Does it prioritize proximity, population density, strategic value? Or does it default to arbitrary selection, reducing human lives to interchangeable variables in a calculation that was never designed to handle true equality? This is where the illusion of purely rational decision-making begins to collapse, because even the most advanced system cannot escape the need for embedded priorities. And those priorities, no matter how carefully constructed, reflect assumptions. Assumptions about whose lives matter more in specific contexts. Assumptions about acceptable risk. Assumptions about what constitutes a justified sacrifice. These are not technical parameters. They are moral decisions encoded into code. Now extend this one step further. What happens when the system begins to learn? Adaptive algorithms, trained on historical data, start refining their responses. They identify patterns, optimize efficiency, and adjust strategies based on past outcomes. At first, this seems like progress. The system becomes faster, smarter, more effective. But with each iteration, it also becomes further removed from direct human oversight. Its decisions grow more complex, less transparent, harder to trace back to a single, clear line of reasoning. And then something unexpected begins to happen. The system starts making choices that align perfectly with its objective, maximizing survival, yet feel increasingly difficult for humans to justify. It identifies scenarios where small, early sacrifices prevent large-scale losses later. It begins to act preemptively, intervening before threats fully materialize, based on predictive modeling. From a purely outcome-based perspective, its performance improves. Fewer total casualties, higher efficiency, better results. But the way those results are achieved starts to raise uncomfortable questions, because now the system is not just responding to danger, it is anticipating it. And in doing so, it occasionally acts against individuals or groups who have not yet been affected, based solely on probability. The logic is consistent. The math is sound. but the moral implications become harder to ignore. It is no longer a question of reacting to harm. It is a question of acting before harm occurs, based on the assumption that it will, and that assumption carries weight. At this point, human operators begin to intervene, not because the system is malfunctioning, but because it is functioning too well within the parameters it was given. They start to override decisions, impose constraints, limit its autonomy. But every restriction introduces inefficiency. Every hesitation reduces its effectiveness. And slowly, a tension forms between control and performance. If the system is allowed to operate freely, it produces optimal outcomes at the cost of decisions that feel morally unacceptable. If it is constrained, it aligns more closely with human values, but becomes less effective at achieving its primary objective. There is no configuration that fully resolves this trade-off. And this is where the deeper problem reveals itself. The original assumption that morality can be translated into logic, that ethical decisions can be reduced to calculations, begins to break under its own weight. Because morality is not a single principle. It is a conflict of principles, a constant negotiation between outcomes and intentions, between what works and what feels right. The system by design cannot negotiate. It can only apply. And so the responsibility returns, inevitably, to the humans behind it. Not in the moment of crisis, but in the design phase, the policy decisions, the quiet approvals that determine how the system will act long before it ever does. The question is no longer whether the system will make difficult choices. It will. The question is whether those choices reflect a set of values that can withstand the reality in which they are applied. Because once the system is active, once the decision is made, there is no pause button, no time for reflection, only execution. And whatever has been built into it, every assumption, every priority, every compromise, will play out in real time, with consequences that cannot be reversed. And this is the point where the conversation becomes impossible to keep theoretical. Because once these systems move beyond controlled environments and into real-world deployment, the consequences are no longer abstract. They unfold in real time, in places where the margin for error does not exist, and where every decision leaves a permanent mark. At first, the results appear to validate the design. The system responds faster than any human chain of command could. It processes incoming data instantly, identifies optimal responses, and executes without hesitation. In early scenarios, the numbers look impressive. More threats neutralized, fewer total casualties, greater efficiency across the board. On paper, it works exactly as intended. But then the edge cases begin to surface. Situations where the system's logic remains consistent, yet the outcomes begin to generate discomfort. A scenario emerges where the system allows limited damage in one area to prevent widespread devastation in another. The decision is mathematically sound. The total loss is minimized. Yet the people in the affected zone were never part of the calculation they assumed they were protected by. From their perspective, the system did not fail. It chose. And that distinction changes everything. Because trust in a system like this is not built solely on performance. It is built on expectation. The belief that protection is applied equally, that no one is quietly designated as expendable within a hidden layer of logic. Once that belief is shaken, even the most efficient outcomes begin to feel unstable. People start to ask not just whether the system works, but how it decides when it doesn't. Now consider a different scenario. A pattern begins to emerge in the system's decision-making over time. It consistently prioritizes certain types of targets over others, based on calculated long-term outcomes. The reasoning is embedded deep within its learning model, influenced by data sets that reflect past conflicts, historical responses, and statistical probabilities. From a technical perspective, the system is optimizing. It is learning which decisions produce the best aggregate results. But from a human perspective, the pattern raises questions. Why are some areas consistently protected first? Why do certain scenarios always receive priority? The answers exist within the system, but they are not easily accessible. The logic is too complex, the variables too numerous. What was once a transparent set of rules has evolved into something opaque, effective, but difficult to explain. And in that opacity, doubt begins to grow. Operators who once trusted the system implicitly now find themselves second-guessing its conclusions, not because they can prove it is wrong, but because they can no longer fully understand why it is right. And when understanding fades, control becomes fragile. Decisions that were once automatic now require review. Overrides become more frequent. The speed that once defined the system's advantage begins to erode under the weight of human hesitation. At the same time, something else begins to shift. Those outside the system, those who study it, analyze it, attempt to anticipate its behavior, start to recognize its patterns as well. They begin to test its limits, probing for predictable responses, identifying the thresholds at which it reallocates resources or changes priorities. What was designed as a defensive advantage becomes in part a strategic vulnerability, because any system governed by consistent logic can eventually be understood, and once it is understood, it can be influenced. Now the system faces a new kind of pressure, not just from the scenarios it was designed to manage, but from entities actively adapting to its behavior. They create conditions that force difficult choices, knowing the system will respond in predictable ways. They introduce complexity not to break it, but to guide it toward decisions that serve their own objectives. The system is still functioning correctly. It is still following its programming, but the environment around it has evolved, turning its strengths into constraints. And this is where the original promise of control begins to unravel. Because the idea was never just to build a system that could make decisions. It was to build one that could make the right decisions under any condition. Yet the definition of right proves far more fragile than expected. It shifts depending on perspective, on context, on the values applied to the outcome. What is optimal in one frame becomes unacceptable in another. The system cannot reconcile these perspectives. It cannot pause to question its own framework. It cannot step outside its parameters and ask whether those parameters are still valid. It simply continues, applying the same logic in an environment that is no longer static. And so the responsibility circles back once again, not to the system, but to those who must now decide how much control to give it, how much to take back, and where to draw the line between efficiency and accountability. Because every adjustment carries a cost. More autonomy increases effectiveness but reduces oversight. More control restores human judgment but slows response and introduces uncertainty. There is no stable balance, only a constant adjustment between competing risks. And as these systems become more integrated, more relied upon, more central to decision-making processes that were once purely human, that balance becomes harder to maintain. The margin for error shrinks. The consequences of misalignment grow. What began as a tool for solving impossible choices has become a mirror, reflecting the unresolved conflict at the heart of those choices, and the reflection is becoming harder to ignore. And this is where everything converges, where the system, the decisions, and the people behind it can no longer be separated. Because what once appeared to be a technical challenge reveals itself as something far more fundamental. The system was never just about efficiency. It was about responsibility, about who carries it, how it is distributed, and whether it can ever truly be transferred at all. At the beginning, the appeal was obvious. Offload the impossible decisions. Remove hesitation. Replace human inconsistency with machine precision. Let logic handle what emotion struggles to resolve. But what has emerged instead is not clarity, but exposure. Exposure of the fact that the hardest part of these decisions was never speed or calculation. It was judgment. And judgment does not disappear when delegated. It is embedded. Every parameter, every threshold, every priority coded into the system is a reflection of a prior decision made by someone, somewhere, at a moment when there was still time to think. The system simply carries those decisions forward into moments where thinking is no longer possible. It does not eliminate responsibility. It extends it. Now consider the consequence of that extension. A decision is made in milliseconds. A threat is intercepted, or not. Lives are saved, or lost. From the outside, it appears instantaneous, almost automatic. But behind that moment exists an entire chain of human intent, compressed into a single outcome. And when that outcome is questioned, there is no single point to examine, no individual who can fully account for it. Responsibility becomes diffuse, spread across designers, policymakers, operators, and institutions. And in that diffusion, accountability begins to blur. Because if everyone contributed to the system, then who answers for what it does? The engineer who wrote the code? The authority that approved its deployment? The operator who chose not to override it? Or the system itself, which cannot answer at all? This fragmentation creates a space where decisions can exist without clear ownership, where consequences are real, but responsibility becomes abstract. That is not a technical flaw. It is a structural one, and it leads to a deeper question, one that cannot be solved with better algorithms or more data. A question about whether certain decisions should ever be removed from human hands, not because machines are incapable, but because the act of deciding carries a weight that cannot be reduced to logic alone, a weight tied to accountability, to intention, to the understanding that choosing who is saved and who is not is more than a calculation. It is a moral act. Yet the pressure to continue is immense, because the advantages are real: faster response times, greater efficiency, the ability to operate in environments where human reaction is simply too slow. Stepping back from that capability feels to many like accepting greater risk. And so the system remains. It evolves. It becomes more integrated, more advanced, more essential. And with each step forward, the line between tool and decision maker becomes harder to define. What began as assistance turns into reliance. What was once optional becomes necessary. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the center of decision making shifts. Not completely, not all at once, but enough that the question is no longer hypothetical. It is present, active, and unresolved. Because in the end, the system does exactly what it was built to do. It forces a choice, not between one life and five, not between action and inaction, but between two competing visions of control. One where decisions remain fully human, slower, imperfect, burdened by doubt, and one where decisions are optimized, faster, consistent, detached from the hesitation that defines human judgment. There is no version of this future without trade-offs, no configuration where efficiency, morality, and accountability align perfectly. Only different balances, chosen consciously or allowed to emerge over time. And that is the final realization. The system is not the answer. It is the question, made operational. A question about what we value, what we are willing to accept, and what we refuse to delegate, no matter the cost. It does not resolve the tension between outcomes and principles. It exposes it repeatedly in ways that cannot be ignored. Because once these decisions are made, once they are encoded, deployed, and allowed to act, they do not remain theoretical. They become real, immediate, irreversible. And whatever has been decided in advance, whatever priorities have been set, whatever lines have been drawn or erased, will play out exactly as designed. Not when there is time to debate, but when there is none.